The handcuffs clicked shut in the parking lot of an empty gas station. The county sheriff smiled with open contempt as she looked at the black woman standing straight-backed in front of her. "Your attitude is what's putting you in a cell tonight," she said. Nobody in the small crowd dared to speak. But exactly 5 minutes later, the phone in the sheriff's office would not stop ringing. The first call came from Army Command. The second came from the Pentagon. And the final call would leave the entire department frozen in silence, because the woman who had just been placed in handcuffs was not an ordinary citizen. She was in the middle of a top-secret national security assignment, and nobody in that parking lot had any idea what they had just started. The afternoon sun hung low over the interstate, throwing long shadows across the cracked asphalt of a gas station on the edge of Red Creek County. Amina Holloway pulled her aging SUV up to the pump, stepped out, and stretched her shoulders after 6 straight hours of driving. She wore plain clothes, nothing that drew attention, and she moved the way people move when they are used to being underestimated. Sheriff Clayton Rusk was parked across the lot, running what he called a routine check, though nobody could remember the last time his routine checks had anything routine about them. He watched her for a long moment before he got out of his cruiser and walked over, thumbs hooked into his belt, chin lifted like a man auditioning for a part he already believed he had won. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, though there was nothing warm in the greeting. "License and registration." Amina reached slowly and deliberately into her jacket, handed both over without a word, and waited. Rusk studied the documents far longer than necessary, glancing up every few seconds to study her instead. "Old car," he said. "Out-of-state plates. You always drive alone like this?" Amina kept her voice level. "I'm just passing through, Sheriff." "Is there a problem with my paperwork?" The question landed wrong, or maybe it landed exactly the way he wanted it to. His jaw tightened. "You got a problem answering my questions?" he asked, stepping closer. Close enough that the gas station clerk inside the window looked up from his register. Amina didn't step back. "I answered your question," she said calmly. "I'm asking what the legal basis is for this stop." It was a simple sentence, the kind any lawyer would call reasonable, the kind any citizen has the right to ask. But to Clayton Rusk, a man who had spent 26 years mistaking silence for respect, it sounded like defiance. Something shifted behind his eyes. "Attitude," he muttered, half to himself, half to the small crowd that had begun to gather near the pumps. "That's what this is. I know an attitude problem when I see one." A young mother filling her tank a few feet away lowered her phone and started recording, though she said nothing. An old man leaning against his truck shook his head slowly, but he too stayed quiet. Nobody in Red Creek argued with Sheriff Rusk. Not out loud, not where he could hear it. Rusk unclipped his handcuffs from his belt with a theatrical slowness, as if giving her one last chance to break, to apologize, to shrink. Amina did none of those things. She simply looked at him, steady as still water, and something about that stillness unsettled him more than any argument could have. "Turn around," he said. "You're being detained for obstruction and failure to cooperate." The crowd tensed. The young mother's phone camera trembled slightly in her hand, and as the cold metal closed around Amina's wrists, she said only 4 words, quiet enough that only Rusk heard them clearly. "You sure about this?" He laughed, short and sharp, and shoved her gently toward the cruiser. "I'm always sure," he said. "Get in the car." The parking lot fell into an uneasy hush as Amina Holloway was lowered into the back seat of the patrol car, her expression unreadable, her spine still straight, even folded into that narrow space. Rusk turned to the small crowd with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had just restored order to his little kingdom. "Nothing to see here, folks," he announced, hooking his thumbs back into his belt. "Just doing my job." But his deputy, a younger officer named Danny Whitfield, who had been standing off to the side through the entire exchange, shifted uncomfortably and lowered his voice. "Sheriff," he said, "we don't really have grounds here." She handed over everything. She didn't resist. Rusk didn't even look at him. "Around here, I'm the law," he said. "Now get her processed." At the station, Amina's phone was confiscated and placed in a plastic bag without so much as a receipt. Her wallet was emptied onto a metal table, its contents spread out and photographed as though she were a suspect in something far larger than a routine traffic stop. Her vehicle, still sitting at the gas station, was radioed in for an unauthorized search. No warrant requested, no probable cause documented. Danny watched all of it with a growing knot in his stomach, but he said nothing further. He had learned a long time ago that questioning Clayton Rusk in front of other officers was a fast way to end up writing parking tickets in the county's most remote stretch of highway. Bystanders at the gas station had not stopped filming. Within minutes, 3 separate videos of the arrest were circulating between phones, capturing Amina's calm posture, Rusk's raised voice, the handcuffs, the search of her belongings without explanation. None of them had audio clear enough to catch every word, but they captured enough. They captured a woman who never raised her voice once. They captured a sheriff who raised his more than once. As Amina sat in a holding area at the Red Creek County Station, cuffed to a metal bench, she looked up at the clock on the wall, watched the second hand, sweep past the 12, and said quietly to no one in particular, 5 minutes. Danny, passing by with a stack of paperwork, paused. 5 minutes for what, ma'am? He asked. Amina only smiled faintly and looked back at the clock. You'll see, she said. Back at the front desk, the office phone had already begun ringing. A tired clerk named Rosa Martinez picked it up, listened for a moment, and frowned. This is the Red Creek County Sheriff's Office, she said. Who's calling? A pause. Her frown deepened. I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? Another pause, longer this time. She set the receiver down slowly, as if it had grown heavier in her hand, and looked toward the back office where Rusk had disappeared to finish paperwork. Sheriff, she called out, there's someone on the line asking about the woman you just brought in. Rusk waved a dismissive hand from his desk. Take a message, he said. I'm busy. Rosa hesitated, then hung up. She glanced at Amina through the glass partition, and something about the woman's calm, patient expression made her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite explain. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time Rosa answered before the first ring finished. This is Army Command, a clipped, official voice said. We need immediate confirmation on the status and whereabouts of a federal consultant currently traveling through your jurisdiction. Rosa's pen froze above her notepad. I'm sorry, she stammered. Army Command? The voice on the line repeated itself, slower this time, each word deliberate. We are aware that a woman matching the description of Amina Holloway was detained in your county within the last hour. We need to speak with your commanding officer immediately. Rosa set the phone down on the desk and walked, almost ran, to the back office. Sheriff, she said, her voice tight, you need to take this call. Now. Rusk finally looked up from his paperwork, irritation flashing across his face. What now? He said, pushing back his chair. He picked up the line without much interest, leaned back, propped his boots on the corner of his desk. This is Sheriff Rusk, he said, his tone dripping with self-importance. The voice on the other end asked one question, calm and precise. Is Amina Holloway currently in your custody? Rusk chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. She's in a holding cell for attitude and obstruction, if that's what you're asking, he said. Why? Is she somebody important? There was a pause on the line, a long, heavy silence that made even Rusk's confident grin falter slightly. Then the voice said only one sentence before disconnecting. You need to release her immediately, and you need to do it right now. Rusk set the phone down, laughing under his breath, shaking his head as though he had just heard the punchline of a bad joke. Army Command, calling about some woman with an attitude problem, he muttered to Rosa, who stood frozen by the doorway. Probably some prank, some activist group trying to rattle us. Get back to your desk. But before Rosa could take a single step, the phone rang again. And this time, when she picked it up, her face went pale before the caller even finished the first sentence. This is the Department of Defense, the voice said. We are calling regarding an active federal matter involving one of your detainees. Rosa carried the phone into the back office with both hands, as though it might shatter if she moved too quickly. Sheriff, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's the Department of Defense. Rusk rolled his eyes but took the receiver anyway, more out of morbid curiosity than concern. "This is Sheriff Rusk," he said again, though this time with slightly less swagger. "Sheriff," the voice on the line said, "we understand you have detained a woman named Amina Holloway. We need you to confirm her current condition and location immediately, and we need you to understand that any harm that comes to her while in your custody will be treated as a matter of the utmost seriousness." Rusk's jaw tightened. "She's fine," he snapped. "She's sitting in a holding cell like anyone else who gives me lip during a stop." The voice did not raise itself. It simply asked, calmly and without emotion, "Do you understand who you currently have in custody, Sheriff?" Rusk shifted the phone to his other ear, glancing instinctively toward the glass partition where Amina still sat, unmoving, unbothered, as though the chaos building around her belonged to someone else's story entirely. "She's a woman I pulled over for a busted taillight and a bad attitude," he said, the lie slipping out easily, the way lies always did when he'd told smaller versions of them for 26 years, and never once been challenged. The voice on the other end paused, long enough that Rusk almost thought the call had dropped. "Sheriff," the voice finally said, "we have satellite confirmation and a verified transponder signal placing Miss Pleasant at ER. Holloway's vehicle at that exact gas station, at that exact time. We are not asking you what you think happened. We are telling you what we already know happened, and the gap between those two things is about to become very expensive for you personally." Rusk said nothing. For the first time all day, he had absolutely nothing to say. Rusk didn't answer right away. Outside the office window, through the glass partition, he could see Amina Holloway still sitting on that metal bench, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed calmly on the wall clock, as though she had all the time in the world. "She's a nobody who couldn't answer a simple question without smart-mouthing me," he finally said into the receiver, his voice rising with defensive irritation. "She's a person of interest to a classified federal operation currently underway in your jurisdiction," the voice replied, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. "Sheriff, you have just made a very serious mistake, and I would strongly advise you to prepare yourself, because in a matter of minutes, people far above my pay grade are going to be walking through your front door." The line went dead. Rusk stood there holding the receiver, the dial tone humming faintly in his ear, and for the first time since the traffic stop began, a small, cold seed of doubt planted itself somewhere behind his ribs. He looked out through the glass partition again. Amina hadn't moved. She hadn't so much as glanced toward the office. But somehow, in the way she sat, in the stillness of her hands, and the patience in her posture, Rusk suddenly felt like the one being watched, evaluated, measured, rather than the other way around. He set the phone down slowly and turned to Rosa. "Get me her file," he said, his voice quieter now, the swagger noticeably drained from it. All of it. Down the hallway, a young clerk named Priscilla Owens, who had only worked at the station for 4 months, leaned toward Danny and whispered that she had never once heard the sheriff's voice drop that low. Danny didn't answer her. He was too busy watching Rusk pace the narrow office, running a hand over the back of his neck the way he always did when something had gotten under his skin. Priscilla glanced toward the holding area, toward the woman who still hadn't moved from her spot on the bench, and something about the calm certainty on Amina's face made the young clerk feel, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, that she was witnessing the opening minutes of something far bigger than a routine booking. She quietly picked up her own phone and texted her sister one line. "Something is happening here, and I don't think the sheriff is in control of it anymore." Rosa hurried to the front desk and began pulling up whatever information the county database could offer, but there was almost nothing beyond a name, a date of birth, and a driver's license number that returned no flags, no warrants, no prior record of any kind. That in itself was unusual. Most people who ended up detained had something: a parking ticket, an old citation, anything. Amina Holloway had nothing at all, as though she existed in the system only enough to be recognized and not enough to be understood. Rosa printed what little she found and carried it back to the office, just as the phone began ringing yet again, the third call in under 10 minutes, each one more official than the last. Rusk snatched the printout from Rosa's hands and scanned it twice, as though reading it a second time might reveal something the first pass had missed. There was nothing there, no criminal history, no aliases, no red flags of any kind, only a clean, quiet record belonging to a woman who had apparently spent her entire adult life staying deliberately unremarkable on paper. He tossed the page onto his desk with a frustrated exhale. "This doesn't tell me anything," he muttered. Rosa shifted her weight nervously in the doorway. "Maybe that's the point, Sheriff," she said quietly, immediately regretting it when Rusk shot her a sharp look. But she didn't take the words back, because somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought had already taken root, the same thought that was slowly working its way through everyone in that building. Some people were dangerous because of what they had done. Others were dangerous because of what they were careful never to show. Outside, in the gathering dusk, 3 black SUVs turned off the highway and rolled silently into the gravel lot behind the Red Creek County Sheriff's Office. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the low, steady hum of engines and the crunch of tires on gravel, arriving with the quiet certainty of people who had never once needed to announce themselves to be taken seriously. Rusk watched them through the window, his stomach tightening in a way he hadn't felt since his very first year on the force, decades ago, when everything still had the power to frighten him. Rosa looked at him, then at the vehicles, then back at him again. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "I think they're already here." Inside the holding area, Amina finally allowed herself a small, private glance toward the window as the headlights swept across the parking lot outside. She recognized the formation immediately, the spacing between the vehicles, the way they angled themselves near the exits rather than the entrance, the quiet discipline of people trained to secure a location before ever stepping foot inside it. Danny, standing nearby, noticed the shift in her expression, subtle as it was, and found himself asking before he could stop himself. "You know them," he said, half question, half statement. Amina looked at him for a long moment, weighing how much to say to a young officer who had, after all, been the only person in that station to voice any doubt at all. "I know the kind of people they are," she said simply. "That's usually enough." Danny didn't press further, but something in her calm certainty told him that whatever was about to walk through those doors was not going to be gentle with the department he had spent the last 6 years of his life working for. The doors of the SUVs opened almost in unison, and the men and women who stepped out moved with the unhurried precision of people who had done this many times before. There was no shouting, no drawn weapons, no urgency in their stride, only a calm, deliberate confidence that somehow felt far more intimidating than any show of force could have. A tall woman in a dark blazer, a federal identification badge clipped neatly to her jacket, led the group toward the front doors. Behind her walked 2 men in similar attire, and behind them, a third figure who paused at the threshold and looked directly through the glass at Amina Holloway, still seated calmly on that metal bench, before offering her the faintest, respectful nod. Rusk met them at the front counter, trying to summon back some of the authority he had walked into that gas station with hours earlier. "Can I help you folks?" he said, his voice not quite as steady as he wanted it to be. The woman in the blazer held up her identification without a word at first, letting him read it fully before she spoke. "Special Agent Dana Whitcomb," she said, "Federal Oversight Division. We're here regarding the detention of Amina Holloway. I need every camera recording from this station, every officer's body-worn footage, and every document related to this arrest, and I need them within the next 10 minutes." Rusk's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. "Now hold on just a minute," he said, trying to reclaim some footing. "This is my county, my jurisdiction, and I don't answer to Agent Whitcomb." Cut him off. Her voice calm but immovable, the kind of calm that came from absolute certainty rather than politeness. "Sheriff," she said, "this stopped being your county the moment you put handcuffs on a federal asset in the middle of an active operation. Now, who signed the arrest report?" Rusk hesitated only a fraction of a second before straightening his shoulders and raising his hand with the same misplaced pride he had shown at the gas station hours before. "I did," he said. "I signed it." Agent Whitcomb looked at him for a long, silent moment, long enough that the silence itself became unbearable. And then she simply said, "We'll need to speak with you privately, Sheriff. Right now." While Rusk was led into a side office, another agent approached the holding area where Amina sat. And for the first time since the handcuffs had gone on hours earlier, something in her posture eased, not from fear leaving her, but from a burden finally being set down. "Ma'am," the agent said gently, "we're very sorry for the delay." Amina looked up and gave a small, tired smile. "It's not your fault," she said. "Just get me updated on the operation status. Is the asset still secure?" The agent nodded once. "We managed to adjust in time," he said quietly. But it was close. Amina exhaled slowly and let her shoulders drop for the first time in hours. "Close is better than compromised," she said. Inside the side office, Agent Whitcomb placed a folder on the desk in front of Rusk and opened it without ceremony. "Sheriff," she said, "do you know who Amina Holloway is?" Rusk shook his head, his bravado now fully replaced by a tight, defensive silence. Whitcomb answered for him. "She is a former Defense Intelligence officer with 2 decades of distinguished service," she said, sliding a page across the desk. "She currently serves as a special advisor to the Department of Defense on a classified program involving witness protection for individuals providing testimony in matters of national security. Today, she was in the middle of relocating a protected witness through this exact corridor, using this exact route, at this exact time, because it had been cleared as low risk and unremarkable." Whitcomb slid a second page across the desk, this one listing commendations spanning nearly 20 years, assignments in 3 different countries, and a security clearance level that Rusk didn't even fully understand the meaning of. "She has coordinated interagency operations most people in this building will never even hear about in their entire careers," Whitcomb continued. "She has briefed generals, she has briefed members of Congress, and this afternoon, she was doing something far more dangerous than any of that. She was driving quietly through your county in an ordinary car, trying to look like nobody at all, because the entire plan depended on nobody noticing her. You noticed her, Sheriff. You noticed her for exactly the wrong reasons, and then you made sure everyone else noticed her too." Rusk stared down at the paper without really seeing it, the words blurring slightly as the full weight of what he had done began to settle over him. Whitcomb continued, her tone never rising, never softening either. "Your arrest," she said, "took her off the road for close to 3 hours. It forced an emergency change to the extraction plan. It put lives at risk, Sheriff. Not hypothetically, actually, because a member of my team, Agent Marcus Reyes, was on the ground trying to coordinate the handoff, and when Miss Holloway didn't arrive, and didn't answer her phone because you had confiscated it, he had to assume the worst and move without her." Rusk finally found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "I didn't know," he said. Whitcomb closed the folder. "That's exactly the problem, Sheriff," she said. "You didn't ask. You didn't check. You saw a black woman driving alone, in a car you decided looked wrong, and you built an entire case out of the fact that she asked you a reasonable question instead of simply obeying without thought. That's not law enforcement, Sheriff. That's a man addicted to being obeyed. And today, it very nearly cost this country an operation 2 years in the making." Rusk tried one last time to find solid ground. "I have 30 years of experience reading people," he said, his voice rising slightly with the last flicker of his old certainty. "I know when somebody's hiding something." Whitcomb looked at him without any particular anger, which somehow made her next words land harder than if she had shouted them. "You read a calm woman answering a legal question calmly," she said, "and you decided that calm itself was the crime. That's not 30 years of experience, Sheriff. That's 30 years of never once being told no by anyone with the power to make it stick. Well, today, someone finally has that power, and I promise you, we intend to use it." Word of the black SUVs had already begun spreading through the small station, and by the time Agent Whitcomb stepped back out of the side office, nearly every officer on shift had found some excuse to be near the front desk, watching, listening, trying to understand what exactly had walked into their building. Danny Whitfield stood near the holding area, arms crossed, unable to shake the memory of what he had witnessed at the gas station hours earlier. and unable to shake the growing certainty that he had watched something far worse unfold than he'd originally understood. One of the older officers, a heavy-set man named Carl Denning, who had worked under 3 different sheriffs over the years, leaned against the wall near the coffee machine and muttered to no one in particular that he had seen plenty of federal agents pass through Red Creek before, but never like this, never this quiet, never this certain of themselves. Another deputy, a woman named Faith Ochoa, who had transferred in from a neighboring county only the year before, watched the analysts working through the footage and felt something close to relief settle over her. The quiet, guilty relief of someone who had long suspected the department was rotten in places nobody wanted to look, and who was finally watching somebody with the power to actually look. Rosa was ordered to pull every piece of footage the station possessed, and within the hour, a small team of federal analysts had set up laptops in the break room, reviewing hours of recordings frame by frame. The gas station security footage showed the entire stop from beginning to end, Amina's calm compliance, Rusk's escalating tone, the search conducted without any documented cause. Danny's body camera, still clipped to his uniform, had captured audio the entire time, including his own quiet objection that Rusk had brushed aside without a second thought. And the bystander videos, already circulating online in small pockets before anyone at the station fully grasped it, showed the same story from 3 different angles, each one more damning than the last. Agent Whitcomb reviewed clip after clip in near silence, occasionally pausing to make a note, occasionally exchanging a glance with one of her colleagues. There was no dramatic reaction, no outrage performed for an audience, just the quiet, methodical work of documenting exactly what had happened and exactly how badly it violated procedure. At one point, she paused the footage on a frame where Rusk leaned close to Amina's face, his expression twisted with irritation, over nothing more than a calmly worded question. She stared at that frame for a long moment before speaking to the agent beside her. "This is the whole case, right here," she said. "We don't even need anything else." By the time the analysts finished their initial review, the list of violations had grown long enough to fill several pages. There had been no articulable legal basis for the original stop. The search of Amina's vehicle had been conducted without consent and without a warrant. Her personal property had been seized and handled without any documented procedure. The arrest itself had been made without probable cause, built entirely on the sheriff's subjective judgment that a woman had displayed the wrong tone of voice while asserting a right she was legally entitled to assert. Whitcomb compiled it all into a single report and set it on the desk in front of the county's assistant district attorney, who had been summoned in a hurry and now sat reading it with a face growing paler by the paragraph. Rusk, watching all of this unfold from a chair near the front of the station, no longer had anywhere left to direct his frustration. His deputies avoided his eyes. Rosa kept her attention fixed firmly on her computer screen. Even Danny, who had spent years trying to stay in the sheriff's good graces simply to keep his job, found himself unable to look at the man without a wave of quiet disgust rising in his chest. Rusk opened his mouth once, twice, as if to argue his case to whoever might still be listening, but each time the words seemed to shrink and die somewhere before they reached his lips, because for the first time in 26 years, nobody in that building seemed remotely interested in whatever he had to say. The assistant district attorney, a soft-spoken man named Gregory Pemberton, finished reading the compiled report just as the sun outside had begun sinking fully behind the hills. He set the pages down and rubbed his eyes with both hands before looking up at Agent Whitcomb. "In 15 years, he said quietly, "I've never seen a file build itself this fast, or this completely." Whitcomb nodded once, unsurprised. "That's what happens when a man believes for 26 years that nobody is ever going to check his work," she said. "He stopped being careful a long time ago." Pemberton exhaled slowly and gathered the pages into a neat stack. "Then let's make sure he understands that somebody finally is," he said. By early evening, Agent Whitcomb returned to the side office and asked Rusk to stand. "Sheriff Clayton Rusk," she said, "effective immediately. You are being relieved of your duties pending a full federal and state review of this incident. I'll need your badge and your service weapon." Rusk stared at her, as though she had spoken in a language he didn't understand. "You can't do that," he said, his voice cracking slightly at the edges. This is my department. I was elected. Whitcomb didn't blink. Elected officials are not above federal law, Sheriff, she said. And right now, you are the subject of a federal investigation into unlawful detention, civil rights violations, and interference with a national security operation. Your badge, please. For a long moment, Rusk didn't move, his hand hovering near his belt, as though physically incapable of accepting what was being asked of him. It was Danny who finally stepped forward, gently, almost apologetically, and said, Sheriff, it's over. Just give it to them. Something about hearing it from his own deputy, a young man he had mentored and belittled in equal measure over the years, seemed to break through whatever denial Rusk had been clinging to. Slowly, he unclipped his badge, set it on the desk, and unbuckled his holster with hands that had begun to tremble. He said nothing else. There was nothing left to say. Amina, now released and seated quietly in the front area, with a cup of water someone had finally thought to offer her, watched the exchange without any visible satisfaction, no flicker of vindication crossing her face. When Agent Whitcomb approached her afterward and asked if she wanted anything done differently, any request made regarding how the situation was handled going forward, Amina simply shook her head. I want it handled correctly, she said. That's all. Not harshly, not for show, correctly. Whitcomb nodded, understanding immediately that this was not a woman interested in revenge, only in the quiet insistence that the system function the way it was supposed to. Within days, the videos from the gas station and the station's own internal footage had made their way into local and then national news coverage, though Amina herself refused every single interview request that came her way. Reporters gathered outside the Red Creek County building, cameras aimed at officers who now moved with visibly more caution, more awareness, as though the entire department had been shaken awake from some long, comfortable sleep. Former employees, emboldened by the sudden attention, began coming forward with stories of their own, tales of arrests built on nothing more than tone of voice, of searches conducted without cause, of an entire culture inside the department that had allowed one man's ego to operate unchecked for years. An internal affairs investigation was opened alongside the federal review, and it did not take long before a pattern became impossible to ignore. Complaints that had been filed and quietly buried years earlier resurfaced. A woman named Teresa Kowalski described being detained for nearly 2 hours after questioning why she'd been pulled over near her own driveway. A man named Julian Boyd described how he had been threatened with additional charges simply for asking to see a supervisor. None of these stories had gained traction before, not because they lacked truth, but because nobody with enough power had ever been willing to look. Now, with federal eyes fixed firmly on Red Creek County, looking away was no longer an option for anyone. A retired deputy named Harold Vance, who had left the department 11 years earlier under circumstances nobody at the time fully explained, gave a lengthy statement describing a culture where questioning the sheriff's judgment, even quietly, even privately, was treated as an act of disloyalty worth punishing. He described being reassigned to overnight shifts for 6 straight months after raising concerns about an arrest nearly identical to Amina's, a Hispanic teenager, stopped for what Rusk had called suspicious behavior and detained for nothing more than nervousness in his voice. Vance's statement, corroborated by dispatch logs from that period, became one of the cornerstones of the growing case, proof that this had never been a single bad afternoon, but the visible tip of something the department had spent years quietly burying. The county attorney's office announced it would review every arrest Rusk had personally overseen in the past 5 years, a number that, once finally tallied, exceeded 400 cases. Some would need to be revisited entirely. Others would simply serve as further evidence in a mounting civil rights case that federal prosecutors were now actively building. Rusk, stripped of his badge and his authority, retreated to his house on the edge of town, where reporters occasionally camped outside, hoping for a statement he never gave. His lawyer advised silence, and for once in his life, Clayton Rusk actually listened to advice he didn't like. A civil rights attorney named Wendell Marks took on several of the reopened cases pro bono, working alongside a small coalition of local advocates who had spent years trying and failing to get anyone in power to pay attention to Red Creek County. Marks later told a courtroom that the tragedy wasn't simply what had happened to Amina Holloway on that particular afternoon, but how ordinary it had become for the department long before she ever drove through town. He argued, and the mounting evidence increasingly supported him, that Rusk's behavior had never been an isolated lapse in judgment, but a pattern so deeply worn into the culture of the department that everyone around him had simply learned to treat it as weather, something to be endured, rather than something that could be changed. Amina Holloway declined every microphone placed in front of her, every camera angled toward her face, every reporter who called her office hoping for a quote. When one persistent journalist finally managed to reach her by phone weeks later, she offered only a single sentence before ending the call politely. "Nobody is above the law," she said. "Not the people who break it, and not the people whose job it is to enforce it." Then she thanked the reporter for their time and hung up, returning to whatever quiet, unglamorous work still filled her days. Work that the public would likely never fully understand, and that she had never once needed them to understand in order to feel it mattered. A grand jury was eventually convened to review the strongest of the reopened cases, and while several of the older incidents fell outside the statute of limitations, prosecutors moved forward on 3 separate counts tied directly to the events of that single afternoon: unlawful detention, illegal search, and interference with a federal operation. Rusk's attorney negotiated for months, arguing exhaustion, arguing decades of otherwise clean service, arguing that his client had simply misjudged a single encounter under ordinary pressure. But the footage told a different story every time it was played back in front of a judge. The same calm woman, the same unearned hostility, the same certainty on Rusk's face that no one would ever make him answer for it. In the end, he accepted a plea agreement that barred him permanently from holding any law enforcement position in the state again. A quiet ending, far quieter than the noise he had made getting there. Months passed, and Red Creek County slowly began to change in ways both visible and invisible. A new sheriff, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had spent 15 years working federal cases before returning home, took over the department and immediately implemented a wave of reforms. Every stop now required documented, articulable cause before any detention could occur. Body cameras, previously optional and often mysteriously malfunctioning at convenient moments, became mandatory and continuously monitored, with random audits conducted by an independent oversight board. New officers went through expanded training on de-escalation and constitutional rights, training that emphasized, again and again, that a citizen's calm insistence on their rights was never, under any circumstance, grounds for arrest. Danny Whitfield stayed on with the department, and under Sheriff Alvarez's leadership, he found himself finally able to be the kind of officer he had always quietly wanted to be. One who spoke up the first time, not only after the damage had already been done. He often thought back to that afternoon at the gas station, to the moment he had voiced his doubt and been overruled, and he promised himself he would never again let a badge convince him that silence was the safer choice. Rosa Martinez, too, remained at her desk, though she now kept a small note taped to the edge of her monitor, a reminder in her own handwriting that read simply, "Ask twice before you assume." Faith Ochoa was eventually promoted to lead a newly formed community accountability unit, a position that hadn't existed under the old leadership and likely never would have. Carl Denning, nearing the end of his career, chose to retire quietly rather than adapt to the new standards, telling anyone who would listen that policing wasn't what it used to be, though most of his former colleagues understood exactly what he meant by that and were relieved to see him go. Even Wallace Doyle, the gas station manager who had watched the whole thing unfold from behind his register, found himself telling the story differently with each passing month, not as something shameful he had witnessed and failed to stop, but as the day he first understood that silence, too, was a choice, and not always the safe one. Sheriff Alvarez, in her first public address, after taking over the department, stood before a small crowd gathered outside the station and spoke plainly, without notes, without the careful evasiveness that so often colors these kinds of speeches. She told them that the department had failed, not once, but repeatedly, and that failure had been allowed to continue because too many people, herself once included, had decided it was easier to look away than to demand something better. She promised no miracles, only steady, visible change, measured not in speeches but in the number of complaints that would now actually be investigated, the number of stops that would now actually require a reason. It wasn't a perfect speech. It wasn't meant to be, but it was honest. And in Red Creek County, honesty from behind that particular podium had been in short supply for a very long time. Late one afternoon, nearly 8 months after that first arrest, Amina Holloway found herself driving through Red Creek County again, this time on nothing more urgent than a return trip to visit an old colleague who had since relocated nearby. She hadn't planned to stop, but as she passed the familiar gas station on the edge of town, something made her ease off the accelerator and pull in, the tires crunching over the same gravel they had crossed months before, under very different circumstances. The station manager, a heavy-set man named Wallace Doyle, who had watched the entire original incident unfold from behind his register, recognized her almost instantly. He came out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron, and approached with a hesitance that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how the conversation would go. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I remember you. From back then, I'm real sorry about what happened here that day. I should have said something. I should have stepped in." Amina looked at him for a long moment, and there was no anger in her expression, only a kind of tired, honest patience. "It's not your job to police the police," she said gently. "But thank you for saying that now." Wallace shifted his weight, glancing toward the pumps where her car sat quietly filling. "You're not angry," he said, more a question than a statement. Amina considered the question seriously before answering. "If a system is capable of correcting itself," she said, "then trust isn't gone. It's just been tested. That's different from being broken." Wallace lingered by the pump a moment longer, watching her check her mirrors and settle back into the driver's seat with the same unhurried calm she'd carried through the entire ordeal months earlier. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and she nodded for him to continue. "Weren't you ever scared, sitting in that cell, not knowing how it was going to end?" Amina considered the question honestly before answering. "I was worried about the mission," she said, "about the person depending on me showing up. I wasn't worried about myself, because I already knew the truth was on my side. And the truth doesn't need me to be afraid to still be true." Wallace nodded slowly, turning the words over, and told her he thought he'd remember that for a long time. She smiled, said goodbye, and started the engine. She paid for her gas, thanked him, and returned to her car without any further ceremony, no lingering resentment weighing down her steps, no need to relive what had happened in front of a man who had already carried enough guilt over simply watching from behind a counter. As she pulled back onto the highway, the gas station shrinking in her rearview mirror, the late afternoon sun caught the windshield and turned the whole world briefly gold, the kind of light that made even an ordinary stretch of road look like it had something worth remembering about it. Somewhere behind her, Red Creek County continued its quiet, steady process of rebuilding, a department learning, sometimes painfully, that authority without accountability was never really authority at all, only the illusion of it, propped up for years by silence and by the assumption that nobody with enough power would ever bother to ask questions. And somewhere ahead of her, new assignments waited, new roads, new quiet corners of the country, where Amina Holloway would continue doing the kind of work that rarely made headlines and never needed to, because she had never once measured her worth by whether anyone else recognized it. Agent Marcus Reyes, the man who had been forced to complete that first extraction without her, later told colleagues that he thought of Amina often, not for the danger of that particular night, but for the way she had handled its aftermath without bitterness, without theater, simply insisting that the process be allowed to work the way it was designed to. He said it taught him something about patience that no training manual ever could, the difference between winning an argument and simply outlasting the noise long enough for the truth to catch up. Agent Whitcomb, for her part, kept a printed copy of the original case file in her own office long after it closed, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how quickly ordinary power, left unchecked, could curdle into something far uglier than anyone watching from the outside might expect. Power can silence a person for a few minutes, an hour, even an entire afternoon spent behind bars for nothing more than the crime of asking a reasonable question. But it cannot silence the truth forever. Not in an age where cameras capture what badges try to bury. Not in a system that, however imperfect, still occasionally proves capable of looking honestly at itself and choosing, even belatedly, to make it right. Clayton Rusk had believed, for 26 years, that his authority made him untouchable. It took exactly 5 minutes, one phone call, and one calm, unshaken woman to prove him wrong. And it would take considerably longer than that for him to understand just how wrong he had truly been.